I promised you I would say what we're doing wrong, and I think there's a few issues where I think are very serious mistakes. First of all, largely because these were programs that were done by organizations that have a culture of secrecy, the intelligence agencies and the parts of DoD that don't operate in the white world, by and large, the public has not really been given a lot of information about what's occurring. There's not been a complete lack of transparency. And that raises two problems. One is, how in a democracy can you engage in lethal force against an enemy when you can't really describe in any particular detail who the enemy is, why they were selected, and more importantly, respond to criticism about collateral damage. You can't really have a public debate about whether or not, in fact, there's been collateral damage and why you believe there wasn't, or what you believe that the collateral damage was, if you're not able to talk about the program at all. So I think the lack of transparency has both been a problem from the point of view of a democracy engaged in a war, but more importantly, it's not allowed us to defend ourselves against accusations that we can't respond to because it's a classified program. So transparency has been a problem. I think we're moving away from the days of secrecy, but it's still not as transparent as I think it needs to be. The second problem, I think, is that this is a really incredibly valuable tool. And it's been used with great effectiveness, largely in Pakistan with the Fatah, and getting rid of very senior members of Al-Qaeda Central. Extremely effective. And I am convinced that it has resulted in plots that were ongoing being abandoned or being stopped because of what occurred in these programs. The problem is it was so effective, I think we may be reaching a stage now where it's being overused. There's been press accounts about moving away from identifiable targets, what's called signature strikes. And what a signature strike is when you don't necessarily know the identity of the target, but you watch them over a series of weeks and months, and their behavior is what you would expect of someone who is a high-level Al-Qaeda official. That has obvious dangers, where you could very easily attack the wrong targets, and you may not be able to distinguish between an Islamist focused on local issues, who's not a threat to the United States, and an Islamist who does have a more global perspective, who does want to target the United States and Europe, where, quite frankly, that is a legitimate target. So I have a concern that we've moved too far with signature strikes in ways that could potentially mean that we are making some errors. And the final issue is not really a criticism of what we've done, but is really more a question that was raised by Jay Johnson in Oxford about 2 years ago, where he asked the question of, well, what's the end game? At what point do we declare this war over? We have pretty effectively demolished Al-Qaeda as it existed in 2001. But the problem is that's no longer really the threat anymore. It's not Al-Qaeda anymore. It's morphed, it's networked. The biggest threats right now is probably an organization that did not exist in 2001, and that's Al-Qaeda on the Arab Peninsula. That's probably the biggest threat to us now. And they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and I can make a legal argument as to why the authorization for the use of military force applies to them, but it's a new threat and a different threat. So it raises the issue, are we in a perpetual war against any terrorist group that is going to have target the United States? And if so, if that's what we are, is the authorization for the use of military force that took place in 2001 really the vehicle we ought to have? Ought there be a different approach? I don't pretend to have any answers here, but I do think it would be very troubling to think of a world where this is a perpetual war. And it may be that we'll still have to target threats, but my view is that the threats are different, and we ought to go back to Congress for a more detailed, up-to-date expression of what it is we're fighting, and not rely on something that is really very different. The world is different, the threat is different, the tools probably need to be different, and we ought, in a democracy, have congressional authorization for this new stage in what we're doing.